topic of my presentation is what is the big deal with high-stakes testing in the United States? First, I'd like to clarify the difference between high-stakes testing and standardized testing. High stakes are tests used to determine punishment, accolades, advancement, and compensation. Standardized tests are tests that require all students to answer the same questions and are graded by the same criteria. So why is this a controversy? Test makers, instead of educators, have been put in charge of education. By dictating what is covered on the test, they simultaneously dictate what is taught. The test puts significant focus on math and reading skills, which all but eliminate the importance of things like social studies and science. Teachers are not given timely feedback, which will effectively drive their instruction to better teach their students. Nonverbal methods of learning, such as art, physical education, and music, are minimalized, if not eliminated, from district curricula. It creates a high demand for success, thereby catering to the students who are able to afford test preparation. This creates a bigger socioeconomic achievement gap. That achievement gap leads to schools teaching to the students who are towing the pass-fail line. They get the bulk of the services, so they tip towards the pass. The high and low students do not get the education they deserve or need in order to be successful. How did we get to this point? In 1963, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was implemented to emphasize high educational standards equally across the country. In 2001, a modern interpretation of that act was put into place, also known as No Child Left Behind. In order to provide checks and balances for states, No Child Left Behind instituted a schedule of testing to be reported at a national level. In addition to the testing requirements, No Child Left Behind required states to make adequate yearly progress in all tested subject areas. It also wanted all students to be proficient at grade level in math and reading by 2014. What No Child Left Behind failed to take into consideration was that every student is different and some will progress faster than others, and for some students, grade level isn't a realistic goal, but that was used against schools and ultimately against teachers. The tests themselves take over 14 hours for students to take in the elementary and middle school levels, and over 15 hours at the high school level. In order to administer the tests, teachers spend upwards of 8 hours in training and filing paperwork prior to testing. Teachers who are responsible for several grade levels could top 20 hours of training. These times for teachers do not take into consideration the time to administer the tests themselves to the students, making the total time for some teachers over 45 hours. This training is required by the testing corporations. Teachers need to be certified to administer each test at varying grade levels, with varying assistive technologies as necessary. These times do not account for test prep time for students or the SAT and ACT tests given to high school students, in addition to the other required tests. The effects are significant on students. They begin with a narrowed scope of education. Students are offered an education that focuses solely on tested materials. Also noted earlier is math and reading. Students as young as elementary school are offered science and social studies on a weekly basis, in some cases rather than daily. Due to the amount of funding required to administer these tests, financial resources are diverted from the students. Staffing resources are taken to proctor the tests, which take away from student-specific classroom support. Technology resources are redirected during testing. Computers are reserved for tests and not accessible to students not taking the tests. Libraries are often used as quiet testing rooms, so books are not available to students during testing time either. High-stakes testing believes that the stakes attached to the tests will motivate the students to learn. Researchers have found that students are less motivated and less likely to engage in critical thinking. High-stakes testing has led to an increase of dropout rates nearly 4 to 6% higher in schools with the exams. Not passing the test leads to retention, which also leads to a higher dropout rate. With the potential of test scores being linked to salaries, job stability, and the content they teach, teachers are questioning the profession they chose. 72% of teachers report moderate to extreme pressure to increase their test scores. Nearly 30% of the time spent on tests or test-related activities takes away from instructional time. Almost 45% of teachers have considered leaving their jobs because of the increased testing requirements. There are benefits to this testing, although many would argue if those benefits really do outweigh the costs of the testing. The tests do give information about student growth. As mentioned before, this information may not be timely, but it does provide a measure of growth. The school districts do get funding for testing. School districts are required to have a 95% participation in the testing to be eligible for the funding. As mentioned in No Child Left Behind, schools must show growth in their students. These tests provide funding and accountability so that schools are almost required to invest in their students' performance. By using the funding for professional development, increased staffing, technology, and resources for schools, growth in the students will be attained. Dr. D. Monty Neal, the Executive Director for the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, commends several states on the alternatives they offer to high-stakes testing. The state of Rhode Island's graduation requirements consist of departmental end-of-course exams, portfolios, an extended capstone project, public exhibitions, and the use of technological tools. Some schools in the state may use results from the state assessment as part of their graduation determination, but if they do, the exams may not count for more than 10% of all the weighted factors contributing to the promotion or graduation, thereby alleviating some of the stress placed on the students taking the exams. Dr. Neal also notes that Maine and Nebraska have followed suit with alternative testing. The research clearly shows more negatives than positives. With politicians that have never taught making requirements for teachers in the interest of supporting test makers who then support the politicians, the students become the ones who suffer. This narrow-mindedness has led to poor-performing school districts getting worse, an ever-expanding achievement gap, and valuable teachers who would lay down their lives for their students, questioning their value. Perhaps the creative teachers should be given the chance to follow the lead of Rhode Island, Maine, and Nebraska, and be able to teach and do what they do best, and let the students' work prove their abilities.